Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we return once again to the forgotten folds of history in search of moments that shaped the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. Now close your eyes and imagine the golden sands of ancient Egypt stretching endlessly under a blazing sun. Picture the mighty Nile flowing like a ribbon of life through this desert kingdom, its banks teeming with civilization that would endure for over 3 millennia. We often think of ancient Egypt as a land of solemn pharaohs, mysterious pyramids, and sacred rituals. But what did ordinary Egyptians do when the day's work was done? How did they pass their leisure hours? What brought laughter to their lives in a world we might consider harsh and unforgiving? The answer might surprise you, for the ancient Egyptians were remarkably inventive when it came to entertainment. They created pastimes that seem bizarre to our modern sensibilities, yet reveal a people who valued joy, competition, and the simple pleasure of having fun just as much as we do today. Let us begin with one of the most unexpected forms of entertainment, the ancient Egyptian obsession with games of chance and strategy. While we might assume that gambling is a modern vice, the truth is that Egyptians were rolling dice and placing bets over 4,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence shows us gaming boards carved from precious woods, inlaid with ivory and gold, suggesting that gaming was not merely a peasant's diversion, but a pastime enjoyed by the wealthy and powerful. The most popular of these games was called senet, which translates roughly to passing, or the game of passing through. This wasn't merely a way to while away an afternoon, it was believed to be a mystical journey through the afterlife itself. The game board consisted of 30 squares, arranged in 3 rows of 10, and players moved their pieces according to the throw of casting sticks or knuckle bones that served as dice. What made senet truly fascinating was its dual nature. On the surface, it appeared to be a simple race game, similar to our modern backgammon. But for the Egyptians, every move carried spiritual significance. The board represented the journey of the soul through the underworld, with certain squares representing challenges, traps, or blessings that the deceased might encounter in their quest for eternal life. Winning at senet wasn't just about luck or skill, it was seen as a favorable omen for one's prospects in the afterlife. Imagine an Egyptian nobleman returning home after a long day overseeing his estates. As the sun sets over the Nile, casting long shadows across his villa's courtyard, he settles down with his wife for an evening game of senet. But this isn't mere entertainment. With each throw of the casting sticks, with each strategic move of their pieces across the board, they're contemplating mortality, fate, and the eternal questions that have puzzled humanity since the dawn of consciousness. The game was so important to Egyptian culture that senet boards were regularly placed in tombs, ensuring that the deceased could continue playing throughout eternity. The walls of some tombs even depict the dead engaged in games of senet with the gods themselves, suggesting that this pastime transcended the boundaries between life and death. But senet was just one of many board games that captivated the Egyptian imagination. Another popular game was called Mehen, named after the serpent god who protected the sun god Ra during his nightly journey through the underworld. The Mehen board was circular, designed as a coiled snake with spaces marked along its body. Players would race their pieces from the tail to the head of the serpent, and like senet, the game carried deep religious symbolism. What's particularly intriguing about these games is how they reveal the Egyptian mindset. Unlike modern board games that are purely recreational, Egyptian games were infused with meaning serving as meditation on life's deeper mysteries while still providing genuine entertainment. They understood something we sometimes forget in our digital age, that play and profundity need not be mutually exclusive. The popularity of these games extended far beyond the upper classes. Archaeologists have discovered simple Senate boards scratched into temple floors, carved into workers' quarters, and even etched into the Great Pyramid itself by the ancient builders during their lunch breaks. It seems that whether you were a pharaoh or a pyramid worker, the appeal of these mystical board games was universal. Moving beyond games of chance and strategy, the ancient Egyptians developed some truly peculiar sporting competitions that would seem bizarre by today's standards. One of the most unusual was a sport that combined elements of wrestling, acrobatics, and ritual combat, performed entirely in the nude and often in honor of various gods. These contests weren't simply displays of physical prowess, they were elaborate ceremonies that could last for days. Participants would undergo ritual purification, make offerings to the gods, and then engage in complex choreographed battles that told stories from Egyptian mythology. Imagine watching wrestlers reenact the eternal struggle between the gods Horus and Set, their bodies glistening with oil as they grappled in the sand, while thousands of spectators cheered and placed bets on the outcome. Another sport that captivated Egyptian audiences was a water-based competition that took place on the Nile during the annual flood season. Teams of young men would attempt to knock each other off boats using long poles, similar to medieval jousting but conducted on water. The goal was to maintain your balance while sending your opponents splashing into the sacred river. These aquatic battles were often accompanied by music, with drums and flutes providing a rhythmic soundtrack to the chaos. What made this sport particularly entertaining was its unpredictability. The flooding Nile was full of debris, swift currents, and occasionally dangerous wildlife. Participants had to contend not only with their human opponents, but also with the river itself. Spectators would line the banks, cheering for their favorite teams, while vendors sold food and drink, creating a carnival atmosphere that could last for weeks during the flood season. The Egyptians also developed a fascinating form of competitive swimming that involved racing against hippos. Now, before you dismiss this as impossibly dangerous, it's important to understand that these weren't wild hippos, but rather semi-domesticated animals that were specially trained for this purpose. The races took place in controlled environments, usually large pools or calm sections of the Nile, and the swimmers were typically young men who had trained for years to develop the speed and agility necessary to outpace these massive aquatic mammals. The sport required incredible courage and skill. Hippos, despite their bulky appearance, are surprisingly fast swimmers and can be quite aggressive. The human competitors had to use superior technique and cunning to gain an advantage, often employing tactics like diving beneath the surface to confuse their animal opponents, or using the hippo's own wake to gain speed. These races were major social events, drawing crowds from across Egypt. Wealthy spectators would sponsor swimmers, providing them with the best training and equipment in exchange for a share of the winnings. The sport became so popular that it developed its own legends and heroes, with famous swimmers achieving celebrity status throughout the kingdom. But perhaps the strangest aspect of Egyptian entertainment was their fascination with elaborate pranks and practical jokes that would make modern reality television seem tame by comparison. The wealthy elite would organize elaborate hoaxes that could involve hundreds of participants and last for months. One recorded example tells of a nobleman who convinced his entire household staff that he had died and been mummified, then arranged for his resurrection during a religious festival. The prank involved professional actors playing priests, fake burial ceremonies, and even a specially constructed false tomb. When the nobleman finally revealed himself to be alive, the celebration lasted for a week and became the talk of Egyptian society for years afterward. Another popular form of prank involved what we might call extreme makeovers of unsuspecting victims. Wealthy Egyptians would arrange for friends or servants to be secretly drugged with harmless sleep-inducing substances, then completely transform their appearance while they slept. The victim might wake up with their hair dyed a different color, their skin painted with intricate designs, or dressed in the clothing of the opposite sex. These pranks weren't malicious, but were seen as expressions of wit and creativity. The best pranks were those that told a story or conveyed a deeper meaning, often incorporating elements of Egyptian mythology or current events. A successful prankster was celebrated for their ingenuity and became a sought-after dinner guest throughout Egyptian high society. The Egyptians also developed elaborate forms of theatrical entertainment that combined elements of comedy, drama, and religious ritual. These performances often took place during religious festivals and could involve entire communities. Unlike Greek theatre, which we're more familiar with, Egyptian theatrical performances were highly interactive, with audience members expected to participate in the action. One popular type of performance was called the contendings, which reenacted mythological battles between gods and demons. Audience members would be assigned roles as various divine beings, and the entire crowd would participate in elaborate choreographed sequences that could last for hours. These performances were part entertainment, part religious ceremony, and part community bonding experience. What made these theatrical events particularly interesting was their improvisational nature. While there were basic storylines to follow, much of the dialogue and action was created spontaneously by the participants. This meant that no two performances were ever exactly alike, and audiences would return repeatedly to see how familiar stories might unfold differently each time. The Egyptians also had a tradition of comedic storytelling that involved elaborate lies and exaggerations. Professional storytellers would compete to see who could tell the most outrageous tales while maintaining a completely serious demeanor. These competitions, known as contests of pleasant deception, were judged by panels of experts who evaluated stories based on their creativity, humor, and the storyteller's ability to convince the audience that their ridiculous tale might actually be true. One famous example that has survived in ancient texts tells of a storyteller who claimed to have discovered a valley where all the animals spoke in perfect Egyptian and had formed their own government, complete with a parliament of parrots and a court system presided over by a wise old elephant. The storyteller spent hours describing the political intrigues and social customs of this imaginary animal kingdom, all while maintaining such conviction that many in the audience began to believe the tale was true. These storytelling competitions reveal something important about Egyptian culture: their appreciation for wit, creativity, and the power of narrative. They understood that entertainment could be both fun and intellectually stimulating, that laughter and learning could go hand in hand. Perhaps most surprisingly, the ancient Egyptians were pioneers in what we might recognize today as extreme sports. They developed a form of chariot racing that made Roman chariot races look positively safe by comparison. Egyptian chariots were deliberately designed to be unstable, with high centers of gravity and wheels that could be detached during the race. The goal wasn't simply to cross the finish line first, but to do so while performing increasingly dangerous stunts. Drivers would leap from chariot to chariot mid-race, stand on their heads while steering with their feet, or even race backwards while blindfolded. The crowds loved the spectacle, and successful chariot acrobats became some of the most celebrated figures in Egyptian society. These races took place in specially constructed arenas with obstacles and hazards designed to increase the difficulty and entertainment value. Ramps would launch chariots into the air. Water hazards would test drivers' ability to maintain control in muddy conditions, and narrow passages would force competitors into heart-stopping close-quarters racing. The sport was so popular that it spawned an entire industry of chariot designers, each trying to create vehicles that were both spectacular and functional. Some chariots were equipped with wings for brief gliding sections. Others had wheels that could transform into boat hulls for water crossings, and the most elaborate featured mechanical devices that could launch the driver high into the air before safely catching them again. Safety equipment was surprisingly sophisticated for the time. Drivers wore padded leather armor and helmets decorated with protective amulets. The chariots themselves were equipped with emergency parachutes made from silk and papyrus, and teams of rescue swimmers were stationed around water hazards to assist drivers who found themselves in trouble. But beyond these grand spectacles, perhaps the most endearing aspect of Egyptian entertainment was their love of simple, silly games that anyone could play. They invented dozens of variations of what we might call party games, designed to provoke laughter and build social bonds. One popular game involved participants trying to perform everyday tasks while wearing increasingly ridiculous costumes. Players might be challenged to eat a meal while dressed as a crocodile, write their name while wearing mittens shaped like fish, or have a serious conversation while balancing fruit on their heads. The sillier the challenge, the more the Egyptians seemed to enjoy it. Another beloved pastime was competitive mime, where participants would attempt to act out increasingly abstract concepts without speaking. Advanced players might be challenged to mime complex philosophical ideas, mathematical equations, or the life cycle of the Nile River. These games often devolved into hilarious chaos as participants struggled to convey impossibly difficult concepts through gesture alone. The Egyptians also enjoyed elaborate versions of what we might recognize as charades or word games. They developed complex riddles that incorporated hieroglyphic puns, mathematical puzzles, and references to religious texts. Solving these riddles required not only intelligence, but also deep knowledge of Egyptian culture and language, making them both entertaining and educational. What's remarkable about all these forms of entertainment is how they reflect the Egyptian worldview. Even their silliest games often contained elements of religious significance, mathematical precision, or artistic beauty. They seemed incapable of creating entertainment that was purely frivolous, instead infusing even their most light-hearted activities with deeper meaning and cultural significance. This integration of entertainment with education, spirituality, and community building reveals a sophisticated understanding of human nature. The Egyptians recognized that people learn better when they're having fun, that social bonds are strengthened through shared laughter, and that even play can serve important cultural functions. As we reflect on these strange and wonderful forms of ancient Egyptian entertainment, we're reminded that the human desire for fun, competition, and social connection transcends time and culture. While the specific forms of entertainment may change, the underlying needs they fulfill remain constant across the millennia. The ancient Egyptians may have raced hippos and pranked their friends in ways that seem bizarre to us, but they were ultimately engaged in the same fundamental human activities that occupy our leisure time today, challenging themselves, bonding with others, and finding joy in the midst of life's difficulties. Perhaps there's something we can learn from their approach to entertainment. In our modern world of digital distractions and passive consumption, the Egyptian model of active, meaningful, community-centered fun offers an alternative worth considering. Their games required skill, creativity, and social interaction. Their entertainment brought people together rather than isolating them. Their fun had substance and significance beyond mere distraction. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let us carry with us the image of ancient Egyptians gathered around their Senate boards, contemplating eternity while enjoying each other's company. Let us remember the laughter echoing across the Nile as friends engaged in elaborate pranks and silly games. And let us perhaps resolve to bring a little more of that spirit of meaningful play into our own lives. For in the end, the ancient Egyptians understood something profound: that entertainment at its best doesn't just pass the time, it enriches the soul, strengthens communities, and reminds us that even in the midst of life's greatest challenges, there is always room for joy, laughter, and the simple pleasure of human connection. Sweet dreams, dear listeners, and may your own leisure hours be filled with the kind of meaningful fun that would have made an ancient Egyptian proud. Looking at your script so far and the reference materials, I can see you've established a strong foundation covering ancient Egyptian entertainment. For part 2, I'll continue with their musical and dance traditions, competitive sports, and social gatherings, while maintaining the engaging descriptive style you've established. But perhaps no aspect of ancient Egyptian entertainment was more central to their daily lives than music and dance. Picture yourself walking through the bustling streets of Memphis during the New Kingdom period. The air would be filled with the melodic sounds of harps, flutes, and sistrums, those distinctive metal rattles sacred to the goddess Hathor. Music wasn't just background noise. It was the heartbeat of Egyptian society, pulsing through every celebration, religious ceremony, and social gathering. The Egyptians developed an incredibly sophisticated musical culture that would make our modern concert halls seem almost primitive by comparison. They had orchestras, yes, actual orchestras, performing complex compositions with dozens of musicians playing harps, lyres, oboes, trumpets, and percussion instruments. These weren't amateur garage bands either. Professional musicians held prestigious positions in society, often attached to temples or noble households, spending years perfecting their craft. What's truly fascinating is how seriously they took musical education. Wealthy Egyptian children learned to play instruments as part of their basic education, much like we might teach piano lessons today. But their instruments were works of art in themselves. Archaeologists have discovered harps decorated with intricate gold inlays, flutes carved from precious woods, and sistrums adorned with the faces of gods and goddesses. Dance was equally elaborate and meaningful. Egyptian dancers weren't simply moving to music. They were telling stories, channeling divine energy, and creating living art. Professional dance troupes performed at banquets, religious festivals, and state ceremonies. These performances could last for hours, with dancers wearing elaborate costumes and makeup, their movements precisely choreographed to represent everything from the flooding of the Nile to the journey of the sun across the sky. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Egyptians invented what we might recognize today as dinner theatre. Wealthy families would host elaborate banquets where professional entertainers, musicians, dancers, acrobats, and storytellers would perform between courses. Imagine attending a dinner party where, instead of awkward small talk, you were treated to acrobats performing impossible feats, dancers recreating mythological stories, and musicians playing compositions that had been passed down for generations. The instruments themselves tell incredible stories. The sistrum, for instance, wasn't just a musical instrument. It was believed to have magical properties. When shaken, it could ward off evil spirits, ensure good harvests, and even resurrect the dead. Temple priestesses would use sistrums during religious ceremonies, creating rhythmic patterns that were thought to maintain cosmic harmony. Egyptian musical notation was remarkably advanced too. They developed systems for recording compositions, though much simpler than our modern notation. Musicians would use hand signals and body movements to conduct orchestras, and they had specific musical modes associated with different emotions and purposes. There were work songs for laborers, love songs for romantic occasions, and sacred hymns for religious ceremonies. The social aspect of Egyptian entertainment extended far beyond formal performances. They were absolutely obsessed with party games and social competitions that would make our modern game nights look positively boring. One popular game called Khnum involved teams competing to build the most elaborate miniature monuments out of mud and straw, with judges scoring based on creativity, accuracy, and speed. Winners received prizes ranging from jewelry to livestock. Another favorite was called the Game of the Pharaoh, where participants would take turns impersonating different gods and goddesses while others had to guess which deity was being portrayed. This wasn't just silly charades. It required extensive knowledge of mythology, religious practices, and cultural traditions. Players who demonstrated exceptional knowledge were often recruited as scribes or temple assistants. The Egyptians also pioneered what we might recognize as competitive storytelling. During festivals and gatherings, professional storytellers would compete to see who could craft the most engaging tale. These competitions had strict rules. Stories had to incorporate specific elements chosen by the audience. They couldn't exceed a certain time limit, and they had to end with a moral lesson. Winners were awarded titles, monetary prizes, and the honor of performing at royal events. Water-based entertainment was particularly elaborate during the flood season, when the Nile overflowed its banks, transforming the landscape into a vast network of waterways. Egyptians would organize boat races, swimming competitions, and elaborate water festivals. These weren't casual weekend activities. They were major social events that could last for weeks. The boat races were especially spectacular. Teams would decorate their vessels with colorful banners, ornate carvings, and painted designs representing their neighborhoods or professions. Races included different categories: speed competitions, endurance challenges, and artistic contests, judged on the beauty and creativity of the boat decorations. The winning teams received honors that lasted the entire year, including preferred seating at public events and reduced taxes. Swimming competitions were equally impressive. Both men and women participated, competing in different categories based on age and skill level. The Egyptians had developed sophisticated swimming techniques, including what we would recognize today as freestyle, backstroke, and even early versions of synchronized swimming performed by teams of dancers who had trained for years. But perhaps most remarkably, they organized elaborate mock naval battles during flood season. These weren't violent affairs. Think more like coordinated water ballet with military themes. Teams would reenact famous historical battles or mythological conflicts, complete with costumes, props, and choreographed sequences. Spectators would gather on artificial platforms built specifically for viewing these aquatic theatres. The gambling culture in ancient Egypt was incredibly sophisticated and, honestly, would probably shock modern casino operators with its complexity. They had dice games that made our modern craps tables look elementary, board games with betting systems more intricate than poker, and sporting events with elaborate wagering networks that spanned the entire kingdom. One particularly popular gambling game called Dogs and Jackals involved players betting on the movements of carved game pieces across elaborate boards shaped like palm trees. The rules were so complex that professional game masters were employed to oversee matches and settle disputes. High-stakes games could involve wagering livestock, land, slaves, or even family members, though the latter was eventually outlawed during the Middle Kingdom period. The Egyptians also developed an early form of lottery system used to distribute goods during religious festivals. Citizens would purchase small pottery tokens inscribed with symbols, and winners would receive everything from food and clothing to jewelry and furniture. These lotteries served both entertainment and practical purposes, ensuring that festival goods were distributed fairly while generating excitement and community participation. Competitive eating was another surprising form of entertainment. During harvest festivals, professional eaters would compete to consume massive quantities of bread, beer, and other foods within specified time limits. These competitions required genuine skill and training. Participants had to develop techniques for rapid consumption while avoiding illness. Winners became local celebrities and often traveled between cities to compete in regional championships. The theatrical performances in ancient Egypt were far more elaborate than most people realize. They didn't just have simple religious pageants. They developed complex dramatic productions with multiple acts, costume changes, and special effects that would impress modern audiences. professional theatre troupes travelled throughout the kingdom, performing everything from comedic satires to epic historical dramas. These performances often incorporated audience participation in ways that made modern interactive theatre look tame. Spectators might be called upon to vote on how stories should end, participate in dance sequences, or even take on minor roles during performances. The most skilled audience participants could earn invitations to join travelling troupes as apprentice performers. The Egyptians also developed elaborate puppet shows using marionettes carved from wood and painted with incredible detail. These weren't simple children's entertainment. Puppet performances could address serious social and political issues, often serving as a safe way to critique government policies or social problems. Master puppeteers were highly respected artists who spent decades perfecting their craft. Magic shows and illusion performances were incredibly popular and surprisingly sophisticated. Egyptian magicians developed tricks that wouldn't be out of place in modern Las Vegas shows. They performed elaborate illusions involving disappearing objects, apparent levitation, and mind-reading demonstrations. These performances often incorporated genuine religious elements, blurring the line between entertainment and spiritual practice. The social drinking culture in ancient Egypt was remarkably complex and played a central role in their entertainment. Beer wasn't just a beverage, it was a social lubricant that facilitated everything from business negotiations to romantic encounters. They had beer halls that functioned like modern sports bars, complete with games, competitions, and social hierarchies based on drinking prowess. Wine appreciation was elevated to an art form among the wealthy. They developed sophisticated tasting rituals, vintage classifications, and social customs around wine consumption that rivaled anything found in modern sommelier culture. Wine tasting competitions were popular entertainment at upper-class gatherings, with participants judging wines based on color, aroma, taste, and the emotional responses they produced. The Egyptians even developed early forms of what we might recognize as reality competition shows. During major festivals, citizens could compete in challenges that tested everything from intellectual knowledge to physical prowess to artistic ability. These competitions were organized like tournaments, with preliminary rounds leading to championship events that drew spectators from across the region. What made Egyptian entertainment truly special was how it seamlessly blended pleasure with purpose, individual achievement with community building, and earthly enjoyment with spiritual significance. They understood something that modern entertainment often misses. The best fun comes when people feel connected to something larger than themselves, whether that's their community, their culture, or their understanding of the divine. These weren't people simply trying to kill time or escape from their problems. They were actively creating experiences that enriched their lives, strengthened their relationships, and deepened their connection to the world around them. Their entertainment served as education, their games built character, and their celebrations reinforced the values that held their society together. As we've seen, ancient Egyptian entertainment was far from primitive or boring. It was a sophisticated, multifaceted cultural phenomenon that engaged people on every level: physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. They created forms of fun that were simultaneously meaningful and joyous, challenging and rewarding, individual and communal. Their approach to entertainment offers us valuable insights into what makes activities truly engaging and fulfilling. They understood that the best entertainment doesn't just distract us from life, it helps us engage more fully with life, connecting us to our communities, our traditions, and our deepest aspirations for meaning and joy. But not all Egyptian entertainment was reserved for grand spectacles and royal courts. In the quieter corners of daily life, ordinary Egyptians found their own ways to pass time and create joy amidst the rhythms of work along the Nile. Picture, if you will, a typical Egyptian household on a warm evening as the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon. The day's labor is done, the fishing nets have been hauled in, and the families gather in the courtyards of their mud brick homes. Here we discover one of the most beloved pastimes of ancient Egypt, the art of storytelling. But these weren't just simple tales told around a fire. Egyptian storytelling was an elaborate performance art that could last for hours, with skilled narrators employing different voices, dramatic gestures, and even simple props to bring their tales to life. The most popular stories often featured the adventures of gods and goddesses, but with a distinctly human twist that made the divine seem accessible and relatable. Consider the tale of Isis and the Seven Scorpions, a story so popular that versions of it have been found inscribed on papyrus, carved into temple walls, and even written on pottery shards. But when told in a family courtyard, this wasn't a dry recitation of religious text. The storyteller would become Isis herself, dramatically fleeing from the evil Set, her voice trembling with fear as she described the 7 deadly scorpions who accompanied her. Children would gasp in terror as the narrator described how one scorpion, insulted by a wealthy woman's rudeness, snuck into her house to sting her child. The storyteller would then shift to a voice of maternal anguish as they portrayed the wealthy woman's desperate pleas for help, and finally to one of divine compassion as Isis, moved by a mother's love, saved the innocent child. What made these storytelling sessions particularly fascinating was how they served multiple purposes simultaneously. Yes, they were entertainment, but they were also education, moral instruction, and community bonding all rolled into one. A single story might teach children about the geography of Egypt, the nature of the gods, proper social behavior, and the consequences of treating others poorly. The audience wasn't passive either. They were expected to participate, asking questions, offering commentary, and sometimes even suggesting alternative endings to familiar tales. But perhaps even more intriguing than the stories themselves was the elaborate system of professional storytellers who traveled from town to town along the Nile. These weren't simply people with good memories and theatrical flair. They were trained performers who underwent years of apprenticeship, learning not just hundreds of stories, but also the complex art of reading their audience. A skilled storyteller could assess the mood of a crowd within minutes and adjust their performance accordingly. If the audience seemed restless, they might launch into an action-packed adventure tale. If people appeared melancholy, they might choose a touching story of love and redemption. These traveling storytellers carried with them small collections of props, simple masks, colored scarves, wooden figurines, and musical instruments. But their most prized possessions were their story scrolls, papyrus documents that contained not the full text of their tales, but rather elaborate memory aids. These scrolls were covered with hieroglyphic symbols, but not in the way you might expect. Instead of complete sentences, they contained key words, character names, and small drawings that would trigger the storyteller's memory and help them keep track of complex plots that might have dozens of characters and span multiple generations. What's particularly remarkable is how these storytelling performances influenced other forms of Egyptian entertainment. The theatrical elements developed by storytellers found their way into religious ceremonies, making temple rituals more engaging for worshippers. The audience participation techniques were adopted by musicians, leading to the development of call and response songs that could get entire crowds singing together. Even the memory aids used by storytellers influenced the development of Egyptian writing, as scribes began experimenting with ways to make their texts more vivid and memorable. The economics of storytelling in ancient Egypt reveal fascinating insights into how entertainment functioned in their society. Professional storytellers didn't typically charge admission fees in the way we might expect. Instead, they relied on a complex system of gift-giving and reciprocal obligations. After a particularly moving performance, audience members might offer the storyteller food, drink, a place to sleep, or small valuable items like jewelry or carved amulets. Wealthy patrons might commission private performances for special occasions, paying not just with material goods, but also with introductions to other potential patrons in different towns. This gift-based economy meant that the most successful storytellers weren't necessarily those who could charge the highest fees, but rather those who could create genuine emotional connections with their audiences. A storyteller who could make people laugh until their sides hurt, or cry over the fate of a fictional character, or gasp in amazement at a plot twist, would find themselves welcomed back to the same communities year after year, building relationships that could sustain them throughout their careers. The training of storytellers reveals how seriously Egyptians took this form of entertainment. Young apprentices didn't just memorize stories, they studied human psychology, learning to recognize the subtle signs of audience engagement or boredom. They practiced voice control for hours, developing the ability to shift seamlessly between the booming voice of a god and the whispered conspiracies of palace intrigue. They learned to read the social dynamics of different communities, understanding that a story that delighted farmers in the Nile Delta might fall flat with merchants in Thebes. Perhaps most importantly, they studied the art of improvisation. While the basic plots of popular stories remained consistent, skilled storytellers were expected to adapt details to their specific audience and circumstances. A story told during flood season might emphasize themes of renewal and abundance, while the same tale told during a drought might focus on perseverance and hope. References to local landmarks, recent events, or familiar community members could transform an ancient myth into something that felt immediate and relevant. The influence of storytelling extended far beyond entertainment into the realm of education and cultural preservation. In a society where literacy was limited to a small educated elite, storytellers served as living libraries, preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. Historical events, geographical information, religious teachings, moral lessons, and practical wisdom were all embedded within entertaining narratives that made them easier to remember and more likely to be passed on. Some of the most skilled storytellers specialized in historical tales, weaving together fact and legend to create compelling narratives about Egypt's past. These historical storytellers served an important political function as well, helping to legitimize the rule of current pharaohs by connecting them to the glorious deeds of their predecessors. A story about the great conquests of Thutmose III might subtly emphasize the military prowess that ran in the royal bloodline, while a tale about the wisdom of Amenhotep III could highlight the intellectual traditions that the current ruler embodied. The religious dimensions of storytelling were equally complex and fascinating. While temple priests conducted formal religious ceremonies, storytellers made the gods accessible to ordinary people through narratives that emphasized the human-like qualities of divine beings. These stories served as a form of popular theology, helping people understand complex religious concepts through concrete, relatable scenarios. The god Thoth might appear not as an abstract concept of wisdom, but as a clever character who outwitted his enemies through cunning wordplay. The goddess Hathor might be portrayed not as a distant divine figure, but as a mother whose fierce love for her children led her to perform amazing feats. This popularization of religious themes sometimes put storytellers at odds with the official priesthood, who preferred to maintain tighter control over religious interpretation. However, the stories were so popular and served such important social functions that they were generally tolerated and even encouraged. Smart priests recognized that storytellers were actually strengthening religious belief by making it more accessible and emotionally engaging for ordinary people. The seasonal rhythms of Egyptian life deeply influenced storytelling traditions. During the flood season, when much of the population was temporarily displaced from their normal activities, storytelling reached its peak. Communities that were usually scattered across the countryside found themselves gathered together on higher ground, creating perfect conditions for elaborate storytelling festivals that could last for weeks. These seasonal gatherings became so important that they influenced the development of Egyptian calendar systems, with certain stories traditionally told only during specific times of the year. The technical aspects of storytelling performance were remarkably sophisticated. Skilled storytellers developed techniques for projecting their voices to reach large outdoor audiences without amplification. They learned to use the acoustics of different spaces, the echo in temple courtyards, the intimate atmosphere of small homes, the open expanses of festival grounds, to enhance their performances. They understood how lighting affected storytelling, timing their most dramatic moments to coincide with the flickering of oil lamps or the play of shadows from a setting sun. Physical endurance was also crucial, as popular storytellers might perform for hours without a break. They developed breathing techniques that allowed them to maintain vocal clarity throughout long performances, and they learned to pace their energy so that they could build to climactic moments without exhausting themselves. The most skilled performers could seamlessly transition between high-energy action sequences and quiet, intimate moments, keeping their audiences engaged through a full spectrum of emotional experiences. The collaborative nature of Egyptian storytelling challenges our modern assumptions about individual artistic expression. While we tend to think of stories as having specific authors, Egyptian tales were typically communal creations that evolved over time through the contributions of multiple storytellers. A story that began as a simple folktale in one village might acquire new characters, plot twists, and moral dimensions as it traveled along the Nile, shaped by the creative input of dozens of different performers. This collaborative approach meant that the most enduring stories were those that proved most adaptable to different circumstances and audiences. Tales that could be easily modified to reflect local concerns, current events, or seasonal changes had the best chance of survival and widespread popularity. The stories that have come down to us today represent the survivors of this evolutionary process. Narratives that proved so flexible and appealing that they continue to be told and retold across centuries. The social status of storytellers varied considerably depending on their skill level and the context in which they performed. Village storytellers who entertained their own communities during festivals and celebrations were typically part-time performers who supported themselves through other occupations like farming or crafts. However, the most talented storytellers could achieve considerable prestige and even wealth, performing for royal courts and wealthy patrons across Egypt. These elite storytellers developed sophisticated professional networks, sharing information about potential patrons, new stories, and performance techniques. They created informal training systems, taking on apprentices who would travel with them and learn through observation and practice. Some established storytelling schools in major cities, where aspiring performers could receive formal instruction in voice projection, character development, and audience psychology. The gender dynamics of storytelling in ancient Egypt were more complex than in many other ancient cultures. While men dominated the professional storytelling scene, women played crucial roles in preserving and transmitting stories within family and community settings. Mothers and grandmothers were typically responsible for teaching stories to children, and they often developed their own distinctive styles and repertoires. Some women achieved recognition as skilled performers within their local communities, and there's evidence that a few even traveled as professional storytellers, though this was less common. Women storytellers often specialized in particular types of tales, stories about goddesses and female heroines, domestic dramas that explored family relationships, or moral tales that addressed specifically feminine concerns. These stories served important functions in transmitting cultural knowledge about women's roles, expectations, and possibilities within Egyptian society. They also provided spaces for subtle commentary on gender relations and social norms, allowing women to express perspectives that might not be welcome in other contexts. The international dimensions of Egyptian storytelling reveal the cosmopolitan nature of ancient Egyptian culture. Storytellers frequently incorporated elements from foreign cultures, adapting tales from Nubia, the Levant, and other neighboring regions to Egyptian sensibilities. These cross-cultural exchanges enriched Egyptian storytelling traditions, while also serving as vehicles for learning about other peoples and places. Some storytellers specialized in exotic tales about distant lands and foreign customs, satisfying Egyptian curiosity about the wider world. These stories served educational functions, teaching audiences about geography, foreign political systems, and different religious beliefs. They also reinforced Egyptian cultural identity by contrasting Egyptian values and customs with those of other peoples, usually to Egypt's advantage. The preservation of these storytelling traditions through visual art provides us with invaluable insights into performance practices that would otherwise be lost to history. Tomb paintings and temple reliefs frequently depict storytelling scenes, showing us details about costume, gesture, audience composition, and performance settings. These images reveal that storytelling was considered important enough to include in the permanent artistic record of Egyptian civilization, alongside scenes of religious ceremonies, royal activities, and daily life. Musical instruments often accompanied storytelling performances, with simple percussion instruments helping to maintain rhythm and emphasize dramatic moments. Some storytellers were skilled musicians who could seamlessly integrate singing into their narratives, creating multimedia performances that engaged multiple senses. The boundary between storytelling and musical performance was often fluid, with many entertainers moving freely between different artistic modes depending on audience preferences and circumstances. The educational functions of storytelling extended beyond simple moral instruction to include practical knowledge about agriculture, crafts, navigation, and other essential skills. Stories about farmers might contain detailed information about crop rotation, irrigation techniques, or pest control, embedded within entertaining narratives about characters overcoming challenges. Tales of river journeys could teach navigation skills while also providing exciting adventure stories. This integration of practical education with entertainment made learning more enjoyable and memorable for audiences who might not have had access to formal schooling. The psychological sophistication of Egyptian storytelling traditions is evident in their nuanced understanding of human motivation and behavior. The best stories didn't simply divide characters into heroes and villains, but instead explored the complex factors that led people to make both good and evil choices. These psychological insights served therapeutic functions, helping audiences understand their own emotions and relationships while providing models for dealing with common human problems. The legacy of Egyptian storytelling traditions can be traced through later Mediterranean cultures, influencing Greek theatre, Roman entertainment, and eventually European literary traditions. The narrative techniques developed by Egyptian storytellers, the use of suspense, character development, moral complexity, and audience participation, became foundational elements of Western storytelling. Even today, many of the basic principles of effective narrative that we use in movies, television, and literature can be traced back to innovations first developed by ancient Egyptian storytellers working to captivate audiences along the Nile over 3,000 years ago. As we consider these elaborate storytelling traditions, we begin to understand that ancient Egyptian entertainment was far more sophisticated and psychologically complex than we might initially assume. These weren't simply primitive diversions, but rather carefully crafted cultural practices that served multiple important functions within Egyptian society. They preserved knowledge, transmitted values, strengthened community bonds, provided psychological support, and created shared cultural experiences that helped bind Egyptian civilization together across the vast distances of the Nile Valley. The time and energy that Egyptians invested in developing these storytelling traditions reveals something profound about their priorities and values. In a society that could have devoted all its resources to purely practical concerns like agriculture, defense, and administration, the fact that they chose to support elaborate entertainment systems suggests a deep understanding of human psychological needs and the importance of cultural life in creating a thriving civilization. Here's part 4 of your 12-part script for Boring History: Strange Things People Did for Fun in Ancient Egypt. Welcome back to our journey through the fascinating and frankly bizarre world of ancient Egyptian entertainment. We've discovered that these ancient people weren't just sitting around building pyramids all day. They were surprisingly creative when it came to having a good time. From their elaborate board games that doubled as spiritual journeys to their death-defying sports and theatrical spectacles, the Egyptians knew how to party. But we've only scratched the surface of their entertainment culture. Now, let's dive deeper into something that might surprise you about ancient Egypt: their absolutely wild approach to festivals and celebrations. These weren't your typical birthday parties or harvest celebrations. The Egyptians turned their religious festivals into massive, multi-day entertainment extravaganzas that would make modern music festivals look tame by comparison. The Festival of Opet was perhaps their most spectacular celebration, lasting anywhere from 11 to 27 days, depending on the pharaoh's mood and the treasury's budget. Picture this: the entire city of Thebes essentially shut down for nearly a month, while the population engaged in what can only be described as controlled chaos. The festival began with elaborate processions where the sacred barks, ornate boat-shaped shrines, carrying the statues of gods, were paraded through the streets. But here's where it gets interesting. The common people weren't just passive observers. They were active participants in a celebration that included public feasting, dancing, drinking, and various forms of entertainment that would have scandalized more conservative societies. During Opet, the normal social hierarchy was temporarily suspended. Servants could mock their masters through comedic performances. Women could engage in behaviors typically reserved for men. And the entire population was encouraged to indulge in excess. The pharaoh himself funded massive distributions of bread, beer, and meat to ensure that even the poorest citizens could participate in the revelry. Archaeological evidence suggests that during one particularly lavish Opet festival, Rameses III distributed over 11,000 loaves of bread and thousands of jars of beer in a single day. But the Egyptians didn't stop at religious festivals. They created entertainment around virtually every aspect of life, including death. The Festival of the Beautiful Reunion was celebrated in the Valley of the Kings, where families would literally party with their deceased relatives. They would bring food, drink, and entertainment to the tombs, creating elaborate picnics among the dead. Musicians would play, dancers would perform, and families would share meals with their ancestors, believing that the spirits of the deceased could participate in the festivities. These death parties weren't somber affairs. They were joyous celebrations filled with laughter, storytelling, and games. The living would update their deceased relatives on family news, gossip, and current events, treating them as active participants in the celebration. Some tomb paintings actually depict these festivals, showing people engaged in board games, music, and dancing while surrounded by mummies and burial goods. The Egyptians also developed a unique form of entertainment around their agricultural cycles. The harvest festival wasn't just about celebrating a successful crop. It was an opportunity for elaborate competitions and displays of skill. Farmers would compete in contests of strength, speed, and creativity. There were grape-stomping competitions that resembled modern winemaking festivals, but with an Egyptian twist. Participants would often perform acrobatic stunts while crushing the grapes, turning a practical necessity into an entertaining spectacle. One particularly unusual aspect of Egyptian harvest celebrations was their competitive eating contests, but not in the way you might imagine. Rather than seeing who could consume the most food, Egyptians held contests to see who could create the most elaborate and artistic food presentations. These culinary competitions featured dishes shaped like gods, animals, and mythological creatures, with judges evaluating both taste and artistic merit. The Festival of Drunkenness, dedicated to the goddess Hathor, was exactly what it sounds like: a state-sponsored celebration of intoxication. But this wasn't just an excuse to drink excessively. It was a sophisticated form of entertainment that combined theatre, music, and religious ritual. Participants would consume specially brewed beer and wine while engaging in elaborate role-playing scenarios based on Egyptian mythology. The festival recreated the myth of Hathor's rage and subsequent pacification through alcohol, with celebrants acting out various roles in the story. During this festival, professional entertainers called servants of Hathor would perform increasingly outrageous acts as the celebration progressed. These included comedic sketches that parodied daily life, improvised musical performances, and dramatic reenactments of famous myths. The more intoxicated the audience became, the more creative and risque the entertainment became, creating a feedback loop of escalating revelry. The Egyptians also developed seasonal entertainment traditions that varied by region and social class. In the Delta regions, they celebrated the annual flooding of the Nile with water festivals that included boat races, swimming competitions, and elaborate water pageants. These weren't simple races. They were theatrical productions, with decorated boats representing different gods and mythological scenes. Participants would dress in costumes and perform while navigating the flooded fields, creating moving theatrical displays visible from great distances. Desert communities developed their own unique entertainment traditions centered around the harsh environment they inhabited. They created endurance competitions that tested participants' ability to survive in extreme conditions. But these were structured as games rather than genuine survival challenges. Competitors would navigate obstacle courses in the desert, solve puzzles related to survival skills, and demonstrate their knowledge of desert lore through storytelling competitions. The Egyptians were particularly innovative when it came to nighttime entertainment. They developed elaborate shadow puppet shows using the walls of tombs and temples as screens. These performances told stories from Egyptian mythology, but with a comedic twist that often poked fun at the gods and pharaohs. The puppet shows were accompanied by live music and sound effects, creating immersive entertainment experiences that could last for hours. One of the most sophisticated forms of Egyptian entertainment was their development of mystery festivals, elaborate events that combined elements of theatre, puzzle solving, and religious ritual. Participants would be given clues and challenges that required them to demonstrate knowledge of Egyptian mythology, history, and culture. These festivals could last for weeks, with participants traveling throughout Egypt to solve increasingly complex puzzles and challenges. The Egyptians also created entertainment around their fascination with the afterlife. They developed elaborate role-playing games where participants would act out journeys through the underworld, facing challenges and obstacles described in the Book of the Dead. These weren't somber religious ceremonies. They were exciting adventure games that allowed people to experience the afterlife journey in a safe, entertaining context. Perhaps most remarkably, the Egyptians created entertainment that was specifically designed to be educational. They developed complex storytelling traditions that taught history, mathematics, astronomy, and other subjects through engaging narratives and interactive experiences. Children and adults would participate in educational games that made learning enjoyable rather than tedious. Their astronomical festivals combined entertainment with scientific observation. During certain celestial events, communities would gather for all-night celebrations that included stargazing competitions, mathematical puzzles based on astronomical calculations, and theatrical performances that told stories about the constellations. These events made scientific knowledge accessible and entertaining for the general population. The Egyptians also pioneered forms of entertainment that we might recognize today as early versions of escape rooms or adventure games. They created elaborate puzzle chambers in temples and palaces, where participants had to solve increasingly complex challenges to progress through different rooms. These experiences combined physical challenges, intellectual puzzles, and theatrical elements to create immersive entertainment experiences. What makes Egyptian entertainment culture truly remarkable is how it served multiple purposes simultaneously. Their festivals and celebrations weren't just fun. They were sophisticated systems for maintaining social cohesion, transmitting cultural knowledge, providing economic stimulus, and reinforcing religious beliefs. A single festival might include elements that entertained the masses, educated the young, honored the gods, celebrated the pharaoh, and provided opportunities for social mobility. The scale and sophistication of Egyptian entertainment also reveals something important about their society. The fact that they invested so much time, energy, and resources into creating elaborate forms of fun suggests a civilization that valued joy, creativity, and community celebration. Even their most serious religious and cultural practices were infused with elements of entertainment and enjoyment. This integration of entertainment into all aspects of life created a culture where learning, working, and celebrating were interconnected rather than separate activities. The Egyptians understood something that modern societies sometimes forget: that entertainment isn't just a frivolous distraction from serious life, but an essential component of human flourishing that can enhance every other aspect of existence. As we continue exploring the strange and wonderful world of ancient Egyptian entertainment, we'll discover even more surprising ways that these ancient people found joy, meaning, and community through their creative and often bizarre approaches to having fun. Their legacy reminds us that the human desire for entertainment, celebration, and shared joy is as old as civilization itself, and that sometimes the most seemingly frivolous activities reveal the deepest truths about who we are as human beings. Based on the reference videos and the script summary you've provided, here's part 5 of your 12-part script. But even these fleeting moments of respite couldn't mask a darker truth about ancient Egyptian entertainment. Beneath the colourful pageantry and joyous celebrations lay practices that would make modern audiences deeply uncomfortable. You see, not all forms of ancient fun were created equal, and some of the most popular entertainments came at a terrible human cost. Take gladiatorial combat, for instance. While we often associate this with Rome, the Egyptians had their own brutal spectacles that drew massive crowds. In the great amphitheatres of Alexandria, captured prisoners and condemned criminals were forced to fight wild animals or each other to the death. The roar of the crowd would echo across the city as spectators cheered for blood, their appetites for violence seemingly insatiable. Picture yourself in those stone seats, the hot sun beating down as sand soaks up crimson stains below. Wealthy Egyptians would place bets on which fighter would survive, treating human suffering as nothing more than an afternoon's entertainment. Children as young as 10 would attend these spectacles, their young minds normalized to violence in ways that shaped their understanding of power and worth. But perhaps even more disturbing were the elaborate human sacrifices that accompanied certain religious festivals. During the annual flooding of the Nile, priests would sometimes offer human lives to ensure the river's continued bounty. These weren't quick, merciful deaths. Victims were often buried alive in the foundations of new temples, their final screams believed to strengthen the sacred structures above them. The Festival of Min, celebrating fertility and harvest, sometimes included ritual drownings, where young people were cast into the Nile while still breathing. Witnesses described how the crowd would sing and dance as the water closed over desperate faces, believing that the river god demanded this price for another year of abundance. Even children's games carried dark undertones. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Egyptian toys were actually miniature torture devices, teaching young ones about the various punishments awaiting criminals and slaves. Wooden dolls with removable limbs weren't just playthings, but tools for understanding the harsh realities of justice in their society. The wealthy elite had their own twisted forms of entertainment. At private banquets, it wasn't uncommon for hosts to force slaves to perform increasingly degrading acts for the amusement of guests. Some papyrus records describe dinner parties where servants were made to crawl on all fours like animals, bark like dogs, or endure physical abuse while nobles laughed and applauded. Women faced particular horrors in certain entertainment contexts. The sacred prostitution associated with some temple festivals meant that young girls, some barely past childhood, were forced into sexual servitude under the guise of religious duty. What was presented as honoring the gods was often little more than organized exploitation that destroyed countless lives. The famous Egyptian love of music and dance also had its sinister side. Professional entertainers were frequently slaves who faced severe punishment if their performances displeased their audiences. Musicians who played wrong notes might have fingers broken. Dancers who stumbled could be beaten publicly. The beautiful art we admire today was often created through fear and coercion. Even the beloved practice of mummification, central to Egyptian death rites, involved horrific suffering for some. While wealthy Egyptians received careful, respectful treatment after death, poor people and slaves were sometimes mummified while still alive as part of certain dark rituals. These living mummies were buried in tombs to serve their masters in the afterlife, their muffled cries slowly fading beneath layers of linen and resin. The contrast between Egypt's cultural achievements and these brutal practices reveals an uncomfortable truth about human nature. The same civilization that gave us magnificent pyramids and profound philosophical insights also normalized cruelty as entertainment. The same people who created beautiful art and poetry could watch fellow humans suffer and die for sport. This duality extended to Egyptian religious beliefs themselves. While they worshipped gods of love, wisdom, and justice, they also honored deities of war, vengeance, and destruction. The goddess Sekhmet, depicted as a lioness, was believed to delight in the blood of enemies. Festivals in her honor included mock battles that sometimes turned deadly when participants got carried away by religious fervor. Understanding these darker aspects doesn't diminish the remarkable achievements of ancient Egypt, but it does provide crucial context for how we view their society. Entertainment, religion, and daily life were interconnected in ways that could produce both breathtaking beauty and shocking cruelty, sometimes within the same celebration. The Egyptians themselves seemed to recognize this tension. Many of their stories and moral teachings warned against excessive cruelty and emphasized the importance of compassion. Yet the gap between ideal and reality remained vast, just as it does in our own time. Perhaps that's what makes studying ancient Egypt so fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. This section maintains the engaging tone while exploring the darker aspects of Egyptian entertainment, providing the complexity and contrast that will set up the remaining parts of your series. Looking at your previous script segments and the reference materials provided, here's part 6 of your boring history, Strange Things People Did for Fun in Ancient Egypt script. But for all the spectacle and grandeur of these public entertainments, perhaps the most fascinating aspect of ancient Egyptian leisure was how seamlessly it wove together the sacred and the profane, the spiritual and the mundane. This wasn't a civilization that compartmentalized fun into neat little boxes separate from religion or politics or daily survival. Instead, entertainment was the golden thread that bound their entire worldview together, creating a tapestry where every celebration, every game, every song served multiple purposes simultaneously. Take their approach to storytelling, for instance. While we've already explored their grand theatrical productions, the Egyptians were equally masterful at more intimate forms of narrative entertainment. Professional storytellers, known as Kiti, would travel from village to village, setting up in marketplaces or outside temples, drawing crowds with tales that were part entertainment, part history lesson, part moral instruction. These weren't just casual entertainers spinning yarns for a few coins. They were cultural custodians, preserving and transmitting the collective memory of their civilization through the power of narrative. The most skilled among these storytellers could hold an audience spellbound for hours, weaving together mythological tales with contemporary events, creating stories that felt both timeless and urgently relevant. They would tell of Isis searching for the scattered pieces of Osiris, but somehow make it resonate with a farmer's struggle to rebuild after a flood. They would recount the adventures of Sinuhe, the court official who fled Egypt and found redemption in foreign lands, making it speak to anyone who had ever felt displaced or homesick. What made these performances particularly captivating was their interactive nature. The audience wasn't passive. They would call out responses, suggest plot twists, even challenge the storyteller's version of events. A skilled Kiti could adapt their tale in real time, incorporating audience suggestions while maintaining the story's essential structure and meaning. It was improvisation at its finest, a collaborative creation of meaning that brought communities together in ways that modern entertainment rarely achieves. But perhaps even more intriguing was how the Egyptians used entertainment as a vehicle for education, particularly for children. They understood something that many modern educators struggle with. Learning is most effective when it's enjoyable. They created elaborate games that taught mathematical concepts, geographical knowledge, and historical facts without the children even realizing they were in school. One such game, called Hounds and Jackals, was essentially a board game that required players to navigate a complex path while making calculations and strategic decisions. But embedded within the gameplay were lessons about Egyptian geography, as the board was designed to represent the journey along the Nile from the Delta to Nubia. Children learned the names of major cities, the distances between them, the seasonal patterns of flooding, all while having a blast trying to outmaneuver their opponents. Similarly, they had musical games that taught rhythm and mathematics simultaneously. Children would learn to clap complex patterns that corresponded to mathematical sequences, developing both musical ability and numerical literacy. The fact that music and mathematics were taught together wasn't coincidental. The Egyptians understood the deep connections between these disciplines, thousands of years before modern neuroscience confirmed the relationship between musical training and mathematical ability. Even their physical games served educational purposes. Wrestling matches weren't just about strength and skill. They were opportunities to teach young men about honor, respect for opponents, and the importance of accepting defeat gracefully. Swimming competitions in the Nile taught not just athletic prowess, but water safety, knowledge of currents and seasonal changes, and respect for the river that was the source of all life. The Egyptians also pioneered what we might recognize today as experiential learning. They created elaborate role-playing scenarios where children could practice being scribes, priests, merchants, or craftsmen. These weren't simple games of make-believe, but sophisticated simulations that taught real skills. A child playing at being a scribe would learn actual hieroglyphic writing. One pretending to be a merchant would learn principles of trade, negotiation, and accounting. But it wasn't just children who benefited from this integration of learning and play. Adults too participated in educational entertainment that kept them connected to their cultural heritage while developing new skills. Craft guilds organized competitions that were simultaneously celebrations, learning opportunities, and quality control measures. Potters would compete to create the most beautiful vessels, but the process involved sharing techniques, critiquing each other's work and pushing the boundaries of their art form. The medical profession had its own unique form of educational entertainment. Physicians would gather for what they called healing symposiums, events that combined serious medical discourse with theatrical presentations of case studies. Actors would portray patients with various ailments while real doctors would demonstrate diagnostic techniques and treatments. It was medical education as performance art, making complex knowledge accessible and memorable. These symposiums often lasted for days, becoming festivals in their own right. Families would travel from distant regions to attend, not just the medical professionals, but anyone interested in health and healing. Food vendors would set up stalls, musicians would provide entertainment between sessions, and the whole event would take on a carnival atmosphere. Yet at its core, it remained a serious educational endeavor that advanced medical knowledge throughout the kingdom. The Egyptians even found ways to make administrative tasks entertaining. Tax collection, surely one of the most dreaded activities in any civilization, was often accompanied by public celebrations. Rather than simply demanding payment, tax collectors would arrive with musicians, dancers, and storytellers. They would set up elaborate presentations explaining how the collected taxes would be used for public works, temple maintenance, and community improvements. Citizens would gather not just to pay their taxes, but to participate in a community event. There would be games for children, food for everyone, and opportunities for people to voice concerns or suggestions about governance. It was democracy disguised as entertainment, civic engagement wrapped in celebration. The tax collectors understood that people are more willing to contribute to something they feel part of, and these events fostered a sense of collective ownership in the community's well-being. This approach extended to religious obligations as well. Rather than treating religious duties as burdens to be endured, the Egyptians transformed them into joyous celebrations. Temple maintenance, for instance, was often organized as community festivals. People would bring offerings not in solemn procession, but in colorful parades featuring music, dancing, and theatrical performances. The work of cleaning, repairing, and decorating the temples became a form of collective artistic expression. Even the most serious religious rituals incorporated elements of entertainment. Funeral preparations, while obviously somber occasions, often included celebratory aspects that honored the deceased's life through storytelling, music, and shared meals. These weren't morbid affairs, but genuine celebrations of a life well lived, opportunities for the community to come together and support the grieving family while preserving the memory of the departed. The Egyptians understood something profound about human nature. We are fundamentally social creatures who learn best, work most effectively, and find deepest meaning when we're engaged with others in activities that bring us joy. They didn't see entertainment as a frivolous distraction from serious pursuits, but as the very mechanism through which serious pursuits become meaningful and sustainable. This integration of entertainment with education, work, and spiritual practice created a culture that was remarkably resilient and adaptive. When faced with challenges like invasions, natural disasters, or political upheaval, the Egyptians could draw upon a deep well of shared knowledge, communal bonds, and cultural practices that had been strengthened through generations of joyful participation. Their approach to entertainment also fostered innovation in ways that purely serious pursuits might not have. When people are relaxed, engaged, and enjoying themselves, they're more likely to think creatively, take risks, and explore new possibilities. Many of ancient Egypt's greatest innovations in art, architecture, mathematics, and medicine emerged from this playful experimentation that was embedded in their entertainment culture. Consider their advancements in acoustics, developed primarily to enhance musical performances and theatrical productions. These innovations were then applied to temple design, creating spaces with remarkable sound properties that enhanced religious ceremonies. Or their sophisticated understanding of optics, originally developed to create spectacular lighting effects for festivals, which later contributed to advances in astronomy and navigation. The Egyptians also understood the importance of variety in entertainment. They recognized that different people had different preferences, different learning styles, different ways of finding joy. Their entertainment offerings were remarkably diverse, ensuring that everyone in society could find something that resonated with them. The introvert could enjoy quiet games of strategy, while the extrovert could participate in boisterous festivals. The intellectually inclined could engage in complex riddle competitions, while the physically active could compete in athletic contests. This diversity wasn't just about inclusion, it was about optimization. A society that provides multiple pathways to engagement and learning is more likely to develop the full potential of its population. By recognizing and nurturing different forms of intelligence and different sources of motivation, the Egyptians created a culture that was both unified in its core values and diverse in its expressions. But perhaps most remarkably, the Egyptians managed to maintain this rich entertainment culture across social classes without losing sight of fundamental human dignity. While there were certainly differences in the scale and sophistication of entertainment available to different social groups, the basic principle that everyone deserved access to joy, learning, and community remained constant throughout their civilization. Even slaves and servants were included in many festivals and celebrations. While they might not have had access to the most exclusive entertainments, they weren't completely excluded from the cultural life of their communities. This inclusion served practical purposes as well as humanitarian ones. A population that feels valued and engaged is more productive, more loyal, and more resilient in the face of challenges. This brings us to perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from ancient Egyptian entertainment: the recognition that joy and community aren't luxuries to be enjoyed only after all the serious work is done, but essential elements that make the serious work possible in the first place. The Egyptians understood that a civilization that cannot laugh, play, and celebrate together is a civilization that cannot truly thrive. In our modern world, where entertainment is often seen as separate from education, where work is divorced from play, where spiritual practice is compartmentalized away from daily life, the Egyptian model offers a different vision. It suggests that the integration of joy into all aspects of human experience isn't just pleasant, but necessary for creating sustainable, resilient, and truly flourishing communities. As we continue to explore the strange and wonderful ways the ancient Egyptians entertained themselves, we begin to see that what might initially appear strange or primitive was actually sophisticated beyond our usual understanding. Their entertainment wasn't just about having fun, though they certainly did that. It was about creating and maintaining the social bonds, cultural knowledge, and spiritual connections that held their civilization together for over 3 millennia. And perhaps, in our own age of increasing isolation and specialization, there's something we can learn from these ancient masters of integrated living, something about the power of shared joy to create not just momentary pleasure, but lasting meaning and enduring community. Welcome back, fellow night owls and history enthusiasts. Before we dive into another fascinating chapter of ancient Egyptian entertainment, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Whether you're winding down for the night in New York or just starting your morning in Tokyo, I'm delighted to have you here for this journey through time. If you've been following along with our exploration of how the ancient Egyptians found joy and meaning in their daily lives, you'll remember we've covered their grand festivals, competitive games, and even some of their darker entertainments. Now, we're going to delve into something truly remarkable: the sophisticated world of ancient Egyptian performance arts and social gatherings that went far beyond simple amusement. But first, let me paint you a picture. Imagine stepping into the courtyard of a wealthy Egyptian household on a warm evening along the Nile. The air is filled with the sweet scent of lotus blossoms and burning incense. Flickering oil lamps cast dancing shadows on painted walls depicting scenes of eternal paradise. The gentle sound of a harp mingles with soft conversation and occasional bursts of laughter. This wasn't just entertainment. This was a carefully orchestrated social ritual that served multiple purposes in Egyptian society. You see, what we're about to explore goes to the heart of how the ancient Egyptians understood the relationship between pleasure, community, and the divine. Their approach to entertainment wasn't simply about passing time or escaping reality. It was about reinforcing social bonds, practicing for the afterlife, and maintaining cosmic harmony. Let's begin with one of their most sophisticated forms of entertainment: theatrical storytelling performances. These weren't quite like the theatre we know today, but rather elaborate narrative presentations that combined elements of drama, music, dance, and religious ritual. Picture a master storyteller, known as a sab, or wise man, standing before an assembled crowd in the torchlit courtyard of a temple or wealthy home. These performances often centered around the great mythological cycles that every Egyptian knew by heart: the death and resurrection of Osiris, the battles between Horus and Set, the journey of Ra through the underworld each night. But here's what made them truly special. The audience wasn't passive. They were expected to participate, to respond at key moments, to help the storyteller weave the tale through their reactions and involvement. The storyteller would begin in a low, hypnotic voice, perhaps accompanied by the soft rhythm of a drum or the haunting notes of a flute. As the tale progressed, other performers might join in: dancers embodying the movements of gods and goddesses, musicians providing emotional punctuation to key moments, even audience members called upon to speak the words of familiar characters. What's fascinating is how these performances served as both entertainment and education. For a largely illiterate population, these storytelling sessions were how cultural knowledge, moral lessons, and religious teachings were transmitted from generation to generation. A child watching a performance about the judgment of the dead wasn't just being entertained. They were learning about Ma'at, about justice, about how to live a life worthy of eternal paradise. But the Egyptians took this concept even further with what we might call practice performances for the afterlife. They believed that the soul's journey after death involved navigating complex challenges, reciting specific spells, and demonstrating knowledge of sacred texts. So they created elaborate role-playing games where participants would act out various scenarios from the Book of the Dead. Imagine a group of friends gathered in someone's home, taking turns playing the deceased soul, facing the 42 judges of the dead. One person would recite the negative confession, that long list of sins they claimed never to have committed, while others played the various divine judges, asking probing questions and testing the soul's worthiness. It was like a combination of theatre, religious study, and party game all rolled into one. These practice sessions weren't treated lightly. Participants took them seriously because they genuinely believed they were preparing for their own eventual journey to the afterlife. But they also found ways to make them enjoyable, incorporating humour, friendly competition, and social bonding into what could otherwise have been solemn religious instruction. The Egyptians were also pioneers in what we might recognise as dinner theatre. Wealthy households would host elaborate banquets where entertainment was seamlessly woven throughout the meal. But this wasn't just about having musicians play in the background while people ate. These were carefully choreographed events where the entertainment, the food, and the social interactions all worked together to create a unified experience. A typical evening might begin with guests being greeted by performers dressed as various deities, who would offer blessings and small gifts. As the meal progressed, different courses would be accompanied by specific types of entertainment, perhaps acrobats performing between the fish course and the meat course, or riddle contests during the fruit and wine service. One popular form of dinner entertainment was the wisdom contest, where guests would take turns posing philosophical questions or moral dilemmas for the group to discuss. These weren't dry academic debates, but lively, often humorous exchanges that could go on for hours. The host might offer small prizes, perhaps a piece of jewelry or a fine wine, for particularly clever responses or insights. But perhaps most intriguingly, the Egyptians developed a form of entertainment we might call dream-sharing circles. These were intimate gatherings where participants would share and interpret their dreams, believing that dreams were messages from the gods or glimpses into the future. But they turned this into a sophisticated form of group storytelling and psychological exploration. A dream-sharing circle would typically begin with someone recounting a vivid dream they'd had recently, but then the group would collaborate to expand and embellish the dream, turning it into a collective narrative. They might debate what the various symbols meant, suggest alternative interpretations, or even act out key scenes from the dream to better understand its message. What made this particularly interesting was how it combined entertainment with what we might recognize today as primitive psychology and therapy. People could explore their fears, desires, and concerns in a safe, supportive environment, while also enjoying the creative collaboration of turning their subconscious experiences into shared stories. The Egyptians also had a fascinating tradition of reverse role entertainment, where social hierarchies were temporarily upended for the sake of amusement and perhaps social commentary. During certain festivals or private gatherings, servants might be invited to give orders to their masters, children might lecture their parents, or women might take on traditionally male roles. These role reversals weren't just random chaos, they were carefully structured with their own rules and boundaries. A wealthy merchant might spend an evening taking orders from his household staff, but everyone understood this was a temporary game with specific limits. What's remarkable is how these performances seem to serve as a kind of social pressure valve, allowing people to explore different power dynamics and perhaps comment on social inequities in a way that was acceptable because it was framed as entertainment. One particularly elaborate form of reverse role entertainment was the mock trial, where participants would stage humorous legal proceedings with ridiculous charges and punishments. Someone might be accused of crimes like making the bread too delicious or causing excessive laughter at inappropriate times. The accused would mount a dramatic defense while others played judges, witnesses, and court officials. These mock trials often became exercises in wit and creativity, as participants tried to outdo each other with increasingly absurd arguments and evidence. But they also served as a way for people to explore questions of justice, authority, and social norms in a light-hearted context that didn't threaten the real social order. The Egyptians were also remarkably sophisticated in their understanding of what we might call immersive entertainment. They created elaborate scenarios that transported participants into different worlds or time periods. One popular form involved recreating famous historical events, with participants taking on the roles of legendary pharaohs, generals, or heroes. But these weren't simple reenactments. The Egyptians would often add fantastical elements, alternative outcomes, or contemporary twists to familiar stories. Imagine a performance where Cleopatra meets the gods of the underworld, or where ancient pharaohs had to deal with the kinds of everyday problems that ordinary Egyptians faced. These immersive experiences often lasted for hours or even entire days, with participants staying in character and dealing with evolving scenarios and challenges. It was like a combination of historical reenactment, improvisational theatre, and elaborate role-playing game. What's particularly fascinating is how these entertainments reflected the Egyptian understanding of time and history. They didn't see the past as something dead and gone, but as a living presence that could be accessed and interacted with through proper rituals and performances. By becoming historical figures through entertainment, they were participating in the eternal, cyclical nature of existence that was central to their worldview. The Egyptians also developed sophisticated forms of competitive storytelling that combined entertainment with intellectual challenge. Groups would gather for tale-weaving contests, where participants had to collaboratively create stories following specific rules or incorporating certain required elements. One popular format involves someone beginning a story and then passing it to the next person, who had to continue the narrative while incorporating a specific word, theme, or character that was chosen randomly. The challenge was to maintain narrative coherence while adapting to unexpected twists and requirements introduced by other participants. These storytelling competitions often became quite elaborate, with judges, prizes, and increasingly complex rules. Some contests might require stories to be told in specific poetic meters, or to incorporate references to particular myths or historical events. The best storytellers became local celebrities, invited to perform at important gatherings and celebrations. But perhaps most remarkably, the Egyptians understood that entertainment could be a form of spiritual practice. They believed that joy, laughter, and creative expression were not just pleasant diversions, but actual forms of worship that helped maintain cosmic harmony. The goddess Hathor, associated with music, dance, and celebration, was seen as one of the most important deities, precisely because her domain, joy and festivity, was considered essential to the proper functioning of the universe. This meant that entertainment wasn't something separate from religious life, but an integral part of it. A well-executed performance, a cleverly told story, or a particularly joyful celebration was seen as an offering to the gods, a way of participating in the divine order that sustained all existence. The Egyptians even had a concept we might translate as sacred laughter. The idea that certain kinds of humor and joy could literally help maintain the balance between order and chaos that kept the world functioning. This wasn't frivolous giggling, but deep, genuine mirth that came from recognizing the fundamental goodness and beauty of existence, despite its challenges and sorrows. As we reflect on these sophisticated forms of ancient Egyptian entertainment, we can see how they seamlessly blended pleasure with purpose, individual enjoyment with community building, and earthly concerns with cosmic significance. These weren't people escaping from reality through their entertainments. They were using entertainment to engage more deeply with reality, to explore its meanings and possibilities, and to strengthen the bonds that held their society together. Their approach to fun and leisure was remarkably holistic, recognizing that human beings need not just physical sustenance and safety, but also beauty, meaning, creativity, and connection. Through their elaborate entertainments, they created spaces where all these needs could be met simultaneously, where pleasure and wisdom could coexist, where individual expression could serve collective harmony. What's perhaps most striking is how their entertainments were designed to be inclusive and participatory, rather than passive and exclusive. While they certainly had professional performers and entertainers, the emphasis was on creating opportunities for everyone to participate in the joy and meaning-making that entertainment could provide. This participatory approach meant that entertainment became a way of building and reinforcing social bonds across different classes and groups. A storytelling circle might include servants and masters, young and old, men and women, all contributing to the collective creation of meaning and enjoyment. As we consider the legacy of ancient Egyptian entertainment, we might ask ourselves what we can learn from their approach. In our modern world, entertainment is often something we consume rather than create, something that separates us from each other rather than bringing us together, something that distracts us from deeper questions rather than helping us explore them. The Egyptians show us a different possibility: entertainment as a tool for building community, exploring meaning, practicing for life's challenges, and celebrating the profound gift of existence itself. Their games and performances weren't just ways to pass time, but ways to make time meaningful, to transform ordinary moments into opportunities for growth, connection, and transcendence. Perhaps most importantly, they understood that the impulse to play, to create, to laugh, and to celebrate isn't a frivolous distraction from the serious business of life. It's an essential part of what makes life worth living. Through their sophisticated entertainments, they created a culture where joy and wisdom, pleasure and purpose, individual expression and collective harmony could all flourish together. As we drift off to sleep tonight, we might imagine ourselves transported back to that torchlit courtyard along the Nile, surrounded by the gentle music and warm laughter of people who understood that entertainment, at its best, is a form of love. Love for life, love for each other, and love for the mysterious, beautiful, challenging gift of human existence itself. In their games and stories, their contests and celebrations, their role-playing and dream-sharing, the ancient Egyptians created a template for how human beings might use their capacity for creativity and joy, not just to escape from the difficulties of life, but to transform those difficulties into opportunities for meaning, connection, and transcendence. Sweet dreams, dear listeners, and may your own entertainment and leisure be filled with the kind of depth, purpose, and joy that the ancient Egyptians understood so well. Tomorrow, we'll continue our journey through their remarkable world, exploring even more ways they found to make life not just bearable, but beautiful, meaningful, and profoundly worth living. Boring history, strange things. People did for fun in ancient Egypt, Part 8. But perhaps nothing reveals more about the fascinating contradictions of ancient Egyptian society than the elaborate rituals surrounding death and the afterlife. While we might expect death-related activities to be somber affairs relegated to priests and embalmers, the truth is far more intriguing. Death for the ancient Egyptians was not an ending, but a transformation, and this belief spawned some of the most bizarre and captivating entertainment practices in human history. Consider the Festival of the Valley, one of the most anticipated celebrations in the ancient Egyptian calendar. This wasn't your typical funeral gathering. Instead, families would literally party with their deceased relatives. They would carry mummified ancestors from their tombs, dress them in fresh linens and jewelry, and include them in elaborate feasts complete with music, dancing, and storytelling. Imagine the scene. Dozens of families spread across the necropolis, sharing meals with their mummified grandparents, while children played games between the tomb entrances. The dead weren't just remembered, they were active participants in the celebration. The preparation for these festivals was itself a form of entertainment that could last for weeks. Families would compete to see who could provide the most elaborate decorations for their ancestral mummies. Professional mourners, skilled in the art of dramatic lamentation, would rehearse increasingly theatrical displays of grief and joy. These weren't simple hired weepers, but trained performers who could shift from heart-wrenching sobs to jubilant celebration at a moment's notice, often incorporating acrobatic elements into their performances. But the Egyptians took their death-related entertainment even further, with mummy unwrapping parties. These weren't the Victorian-era curiosities you might imagine, but ancient Egyptian social gatherings where families would ceremonially unwrap and rewrap their ancestors while recounting family histories and legends. The process could take hours, with each layer of linen revealing amulets, jewelry, and personal items that would spark new stories and memories. Professional storytellers would weave these discoveries into epic narratives, transforming a simple unwrapping into an immersive theatrical experience. Even more extraordinary were the travelling mummy shows that wealthy families would organise. These elaborate processions would transport mummified relatives from town to town, complete with musicians, dancers, and performers who would reenact the deceased person's greatest achievements. These weren't solemn funeral marches, but vibrant celebrations that could last for days, with each stop featuring different entertainment tailored to local tastes and traditions. The ancient Egyptians also developed a peculiar form of interactive storytelling centered around the afterlife journey. Families would gather in tomb chambers and take turns narrating their deceased relatives' adventures in the underworld, using the elaborate wall paintings as visual aids. These sessions could become incredibly elaborate, with participants taking on different roles, some playing gods, others representing demons or helpful spirits. Children were especially encouraged to participate, learning family history and religious beliefs through these immersive storytelling sessions. Perhaps most remarkably, the Egyptians created what we might recognize today as the world's first escape rooms, built directly into tomb complexes. These weren't designed to keep grave robbers out, but rather to entertain visiting family members. The puzzles and challenges were based on scenes from the Book of the Dead, requiring visitors to demonstrate their knowledge of afterlife navigation to progress through different chambers. Successful completion of these challenges was believed to provide spiritual benefits to both the living participants and their deceased relatives. The wealthy elite took this concept even further, commissioning elaborate mechanical contraptions for their family tombs. These devices, operated by hidden counterweights and water systems, could create moving statues, opening and closing doors, and even simulated conversations with the dead through cleverly hidden speaking tubes operated by concealed priests. Visiting these tombs became a form of entertainment that combined religious devotion with technological marvel. But not all death-related entertainment was reserved for family members. The Egyptians also developed public spectacles around mummification itself. Skilled embalmers would sometimes perform their craft in public squares during major festivals, turning the preservation process into educational entertainment. Crowds would gather to watch master embalmers demonstrate their techniques on practice bodies, often accompanied by musicians and storytellers who would explain the religious significance of each step. These public mummification demonstrations sometimes evolved into competitions, with different embalming houses showcasing their skills and competing for prestigious contracts. Judges would evaluate not just the technical quality of the mummification, but also the entertainment value of the presentation. The most successful embalmers became celebrities in their own right, traveling from city to city to perform their craft before appreciative audiences. The Egyptians even gamified death through elaborate board games that simulated the journey through the afterlife. These weren't simple diversions, but complex strategic games that could take days to complete. Players would navigate their pieces through a board representing the underworld, encountering challenges based on actual religious texts. The games served multiple purposes: entertainment, education, and spiritual preparation for their own eventual death journey. The most elaborate of these games required multiple players taking on different roles: gods, demons, and deceased souls, with intricate rules governing their interactions. Successful players were believed to gain actual spiritual benefits, making these games both entertainment and religious practice. Tournaments could last for weeks, with entire communities gathering to watch expert players navigate the complex spiritual challenges. But perhaps the most bizarre death-related entertainment was the practice of prophetic mummy consultation. Certain mummified individuals, usually those who had been renowned for their wisdom in life, were believed to continue offering advice after death. Families would bring their preserved ancestors to social gatherings, where guests could pose questions about everything from business decisions to romantic troubles. Priests, acting as interpreters, would provide answers supposedly coming from the mummy, often delivered in elaborate theatrical performances, complete with special effects created by hidden assistants. These consultation sessions became highly sought-after entertainment, with particularly famous mummies developing followings that crossed social boundaries. Wealthy patrons would compete to host these events, turning their homes into temporary oracles where the living and dead could supposedly interact. The most skilled priest-interpreters became entertainers in their own right, developing signature styles and loyal audiences who would follow them from consultation to consultation. The ancient Egyptians also created elaborate death-themed festivals that celebrated the cycle of life and death through community participation. During these events, entire neighborhoods would transform into massive theatrical productions, with houses representing different stages of the afterlife journey. Participants would progress from building to building, encountering challenges and entertainments designed to simulate the deceased's path through the underworld. These neighborhood festivals could last for days, with each household contributing different elements to the overall experience. Some might specialize in creating terrifying demon encounters, while others focused on peaceful garden scenes representing the field of reeds. The most creative households would develop mechanical puppets, light shows using polished metal mirrors, and even underground tunnels connecting different houses to create surprise appearances. What's remarkable about these death-centered entertainment practices is how they reflect the Egyptian understanding of existence as a continuous cycle, rather than a linear progression from life to death. Their games, festivals, and performances didn't morbidly dwell on death, but rather celebrated it as another form of existence worthy of joy, creativity, and community participation. These practices also reveal the profound social function of entertainment in ancient Egypt. By involving the entire community in death-related celebrations, the Egyptians created support networks that helped families cope with loss while maintaining connections to their ancestors. The elaborate nature of these entertainments also served to reinforce social hierarchies and religious beliefs, but in ways that felt joyful rather than oppressive. The technological innovation evident in these death-related entertainments is equally impressive. The mechanical devices, hidden chambers, and special effects created for tomb entertainment represent some of the most sophisticated engineering of the ancient world. These weren't just religious artifacts, but entertainment technologies that required advanced knowledge of physics, hydraulics, and acoustics. Perhaps most importantly, these practices demonstrate how the ancient Egyptians refused to let even death diminish their capacity for joy, creativity, and social connection. In a world where mortality was an ever-present reality, they chose to transform their relationship with death into opportunities for celebration, learning, and community building. Their approach offers a striking contrast to many modern attitudes toward death and mourning. Where we often see death as a private, somber affair, the Egyptians made it a public celebration of life's continuity. Their elaborate entertainments surrounding death weren't denial or avoidance, but rather a sophisticated cultural response that acknowledged death's reality while refusing to let it dominate their emotional landscape. These death-centered entertainment practices ultimately reveal the depth and complexity of ancient Egyptian civilization. They were a people who could find joy and meaning in every aspect of existence, transforming even the most challenging human experiences into opportunities for creativity, connection, and celebration. Their legacy reminds us that entertainment and joy aren't frivolous additions to life, but essential elements that help us navigate existence's full spectrum of experiences. In understanding how the ancient Egyptians turned death into entertainment, we gain insight not just into their remarkable civilization, but into the human capacity for resilience, creativity, and connection. Their practices challenge us to consider how we might approach our own difficult experiences with similar imagination and community spirit, finding ways to transform challenge into celebration and isolation into connection. Looking at your existing script content and the reference materials, here's part 9 of your 12-part YouTube video script on ancient Egyptian entertainment. Now we must venture into perhaps the most fascinating aspect of ancient Egyptian entertainment, their elaborate death games and afterlife spectacles. While we've explored their mystical board games and grand festivals, Nothing quite captures the Egyptian imagination like their relationship with death itself, which they transformed from something to be feared into the ultimate form of entertainment. Picture, if you will, the grand necropolis of Saqqara during the height of the Old Kingdom. Here, death was not an ending, but a spectacular beginning. A theatrical production that could last for months and involve entire communities. The wealthy elite didn't simply die. They orchestrated their own eternal entertainment, complete with intricate puzzles, hidden chambers, and elaborate performances that would continue long after their last breath. The process began with what we might call death auditions. Elaborate planning sessions where the soon-to-be deceased would work with priests, architects, and performers to design their ultimate afterlife experience. These weren't somber affairs, but rather creative workshops buzzing with excitement. Imagine a pharaoh spending his final years not in despair, but in the thrilling anticipation of directing his own cosmic drama. The mummification process itself became a form of ritualized theatre. Far from the sterile clinical procedure we might imagine, it was a 70-day festival of preservation that drew crowds from across the kingdom. Spectators would gather to witness the careful choreography of the embalmers, who performed their sacred duties with the precision of master performers. Each step, from the removal of organs to the wrapping in linen, was accompanied by chants, music, and elaborate ceremonies that transformed the deceased into the star of their own eternal show. But the real entertainment began with the tomb itself. Egyptian tombs weren't merely burial chambers. They were elaborate escape rooms designed to challenge and delight both the deceased and future visitors. The wealthy would commission architects to create mind-bending puzzles, secret passages, and booby traps that would keep grave robbers at bay while providing endless amusement for the departed soul navigating the afterlife. The tomb of Khaem-Waset, son of Ramesses II, featured what archaeologists now recognize as one of history's first interactive entertainment complexes. Visitors, both living and dead, could trigger mechanical devices that would animate painted figures on the walls, creating primitive but effective moving pictures that told the story of the deceased's journey through the underworld. These weren't static paintings, but dynamic narratives that unfolded as viewers solved riddles and activated hidden mechanisms. The walls themselves became canvases for what we might call the world's first immersive storytelling experiences. The famous tomb paintings we admire today weren't just art, they were interactive entertainment systems. Priests would guide visitors through elaborate tours, using torchlight to animate the figures and create shadow plays that brought the painted scenes to life. The flickering flames would make the painted dancers appear to move. The musicians seem to play, and the hunting scenes come alive with motion and drama. These tomb entertainments served multiple purposes within Egyptian society. For the living, they provided a unique form of recreational activity that combined education, spiritual reflection, and pure spectacle. Families would organize elaborate picnics in the courtyards of tombs, treating these sacred spaces as entertainment venues where they could commune with their ancestors while enjoying music, dance, and storytelling. The deceased, according to Egyptian belief, continued to participate in these entertainments. The elaborate false doors found in many tombs weren't merely symbolic. They were believed to be functional portals through which the dead could emerge to join the festivities. Tomb owners would commission ongoing performances, ensuring that professional entertainers would regularly visit their burial sites to perform for both the living visitors and the deceased occupants. Perhaps most remarkably, the Egyptians developed what we might call death tourism, organized expeditions to visit famous tombs and participate in their associated entertainments. The tomb of the architect Hezi-Ra became particularly popular for its innovative acoustic design, which created haunting echo effects that visitors interpreted as the voice of the deceased offering commentary on the performances taking place in his honor. The practice of tomb theatre reached its zenith during the New Kingdom, when wealthy Egyptians began commissioning fully functional performance spaces within their burial complexes. These underground amphitheatres could accommodate dozens of performers and hundreds of spectators, creating a literally underground entertainment industry that thrived for centuries. The psychological impact of these death entertainments on Egyptian society cannot be overstated. By transforming death into a form of spectacular entertainment, the Egyptians essentially eliminated the fear that plagued other ancient cultures. Death became something to anticipate with excitement rather than dread, knowing that it marked the beginning of an eternal entertainment experience rather than an ending. This transformation of mortality into spectacle influenced every aspect of Egyptian life. People lived not just for the present moment, but for their future entertainment value. They accumulated stories, developed skills, and cultivated relationships that would enhance their eternal performance. In effect, every Egyptian became both the protagonist and director of their own cosmic entertainment production. The ripple effects extended beyond individual entertainment to reshape Egyptian concepts of memory, legacy, and community. The dead weren't forgotten or mourned in the traditional sense. They became permanent cast members in an ongoing community theatre production that spanned generations. Families would visit tombs not to grieve, but to participate in elaborate entertainments that kept the memory of their ancestors vibrantly alive. These death spectacles also served as powerful tools for social cohesion and cultural transmission. The stories told in tombs, the puzzles solved, and the performances witnessed all served to reinforce Egyptian values, beliefs, and traditions. Children learned about their heritage not through dry recitation, but through thrilling adventures in the elaborate entertainment complexes of the dead. The economic impact was equally significant. The death entertainment industry employed thousands of craftsmen, performers, architects, and priests, creating an entire economic sector devoted to posthumous pleasure. Tomb construction became one of Egypt's largest industries, not merely for religious reasons, but because these elaborate entertainment complexes required massive resources and sophisticated planning. Modern archaeologists continue to discover new layers of these ancient entertainment systems. Recent excavations have revealed tombs equipped with hydraulic mechanisms that could create fountain displays, acoustic chambers designed to amplify and distort sound for dramatic effect, and even primitive automated systems that could trigger sequences of lights and sounds to create immersive experiences that would impress visitors centuries after their creation. The sophistication of these death entertainments reveals a civilization that had mastered not just the practical aspects of life, but had elevated the very concept of entertainment to cosmic proportions. The Egyptians understood that true entertainment transcends the boundaries between life and death, creating experiences that could provide joy, wonder, and meaning across the vast expanse of eternity. As we stand today, in the shadow of these ancient monuments, we're not just viewing archaeological artifacts, but witnessing the remains of the world's most ambitious entertainment project. A civilization-wide effort to transform death itself into the ultimate form of recreational activity. The Egyptians succeeded in creating entertainment that was literally timeless, providing amusement and wonder that continues to captivate audiences thousands of years after the last performance ended. Boring history. Strange things people did for fun in ancient Egypt. Part 10. The elaborate festivals and death rituals of ancient Egypt were not merely entertainment. They were sophisticated mechanisms of social engineering that transformed the most primal human experiences into spectacles of collective meaning. But beyond these grand displays lay another layer of Egyptian entertainment culture, one that reveals perhaps the most fascinating aspect of how this civilization understood pleasure, power, and the human condition itself. The Egyptians possessed what we might call an institutionalized approach to fun, a systematic method of organizing leisure that served multiple masters simultaneously. Entertainment was never just entertainment. It was education, it was politics, it was religion, and it was social control, all wrapped into experiences so compelling that participants rarely questioned the deeper currents flowing beneath the surface of their enjoyment. Consider the phenomenon of Egyptian sporting competitions, which evolved far beyond simple athletic contests into elaborate theatrical productions that could last for weeks. The most spectacular of these were the river festivals, where entire communities would gather along the Nile to witness competitions that combined athleticism with religious ceremony and political messaging in ways that would make modern event planners weep with envy. The Festival of Opet, held annually in Thebes, exemplifies this multi-layered approach to entertainment. What appeared to be a celebration of the god Amun's journey from Karnak to Luxor was actually a masterpiece of ancient edutainment. Spectators would line the riverbanks for miles, watching as elaborately decorated barges carried the sacred statues of the gods down the Nile, accompanied by hundreds of performers, musicians, and athletes competing in synchronized swimming displays, wrestling matches, and boat races that told the story of creation itself. But here's where it gets really interesting. These festivals weren't just watched, they were participated in by people from every social class, creating temporary communities where normal hierarchies were suspended or even inverted. Slaves could compete against nobles in certain events, women could judge male competitors, and children could mock their elders in sanctioned comedy performances. For brief, carefully controlled periods, Egyptian society turned itself upside down in the name of entertainment. The psychological sophistication of this approach becomes clear when we examine the records kept by festival organizers. Yes, they actually had ancient event planners who documented attendance, crowd reactions, and the effectiveness of different entertainment strategies. These papyrus documents reveal that Egyptian authorities understood concepts we now associate with modern psychology. The need for cathartic release, the power of shared emotional experiences to build social cohesion, and the way that controlled transgression could actually strengthen social norms by providing safe outlets for rebellion. Take the Feast of Drunkenness, celebrated in honor of the goddess Hathor. This wasn't just an excuse to party. It was a carefully orchestrated exploration of altered consciousness that served both religious and social functions. Participants would consume specially prepared alcoholic beverages designed to induce specific types of intoxication, from mild euphoria to profound spiritual visions. But the drinking was structured around elaborate games and challenges that tested not just physical coordination, but moral reasoning, creative thinking, and social bonding. The games themselves were ingenious. One popular activity involved teams of intoxicated participants trying to navigate obstacle courses while maintaining complex group chants that told mythological stories. Another required drunk individuals to paint murals depicting their dreams and fears, which were then interpreted by priests and used for community counseling sessions. The Egyptians had essentially invented therapeutic recreation 3,000 years before we gave it a name. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Egyptian entertainment culture was their development of what we might call immersive reality experiences, elaborate role-playing events that could last for months and involved entire cities. The most famous of these was the Annual Judgment, where communities would reenact the mythological trial of Osiris, with ordinary citizens playing the roles of gods, demons, and cosmic forces. These weren't simple pageants. Participants underwent extensive preparation, learning not just their roles, but the philosophical and theological principles behind them. They studied acting techniques, practiced ritualized combat, and mastered the complex musical and poetic traditions associated with their characters. When the event finally began, the entire community would be transformed into a living mythology, where every interaction carried deeper meaning and every decision had cosmic significance. the psychological impact of these experiences was profound. Participants reported lasting changes in their worldview, their relationships, and their understanding of their place in the cosmic order. Modern researchers studying these ancient accounts have identified parallels with contemporary immersive theatre, virtual reality experiences, and even modern therapeutic techniques like psychodrama. What made these Egyptian entertainment formats so effective was their integration of multiple sensory modalities and meaning-making systems. A single festival might combine visual spectacle, musical performance, physical challenge, intellectual puzzle solving, spiritual practice, social bonding, and political education into a seamless whole that engaged participants on every level of their being. The Egyptians also understood something that modern entertainment often forgets: the power of genuine stakes. Their games and competitions weren't just diversions. They had real consequences for participants' social status, economic opportunities, and even their prospects in the afterlife. When you're competing in a chariot race that will determine not just who wins a prize, but who gets to marry the pharaoh's daughter, or who earns the right to be buried in a particular cemetery, the entertainment takes on a weight and intensity that makes modern sports seem almost trivial by comparison. This integration of entertainment with life's most important decisions created a culture where fun was never frivolous. Every joke, every game, every festival was an opportunity for personal growth, social advancement, and spiritual development. The Egyptians had created a civilization where entertainment and meaning were so thoroughly intertwined that the very concept of mere amusement would have seemed bizarre. The decline of this entertainment culture offers sobering lessons for our own time. As Egypt was conquered by successive empires, Persian, Greek, Roman, the new rulers often maintained the surface forms of Egyptian festivals and games while stripping away their deeper meaning and social function. The result was entertainment that looked similar but felt hollow, spectacle without substance, fun without purpose. The Roman-era accounts of Egyptian festivals describe events that were more elaborate and expensive than ever before, but somehow less satisfying to participants. The careful balance between individual pleasure and collective meaning had been lost, replaced by a more familiar pattern of passive consumption and hierarchical display. Entertainment had become something done to people rather than something done by and with them. This transformation reveals perhaps the most important insight from ancient Egyptian entertainment culture: that true fun, the kind that nourishes the human spirit and strengthens social bonds, requires more than just pleasure or excitement. It requires meaning, purpose, and genuine connection to something larger than ourselves. The Egyptians understood that entertainment at its best is not an escape from life, but a deeper engagement with it. Not a distraction from our humanity, but a celebration of it. As we reflect on these ancient approaches to fun and leisure, we might ask ourselves what our own entertainment culture says about our values, our understanding of human nature, and our vision of the good life. Do our games and festivals and spectacles bring us together or drive us apart? Do they make us more ourselves or less? Do they help us grow or keep us static? The legacy of ancient Egyptian entertainment culture suggests that these questions matter more than we might think. In their festivals and games and elaborate death rituals, the Egyptians created not just diversions but technologies of human flourishing, sophisticated methods for helping people become more fully themselves while remaining connected to their communities and their cosmos. That may be the strangest thing of all about ancient Egyptian entertainment. Not that it was so different from our own, but that it accomplished so much more with so much less. They turned the simple human desire for fun into a force for education, social cohesion, spiritual development, and personal transformation. They proved that entertainment, at its best, is not about forgetting who we are, but about remembering who we might become. Part 11. The enduring magic of ancient Egyptian entertainment. As we approach the final chapter of our journey through the strange and wonderful world of ancient Egyptian entertainment, we find ourselves confronting a profound paradox. Here was a civilization that lived so intimately with death, yet celebrated life with such exuberant joy. They built their greatest monuments as tombs, yet filled their days with games, festivals, music, and laughter that echoed across the Nile for over 3 millennia. The ancient Egyptians understood something that perhaps we have forgotten in our modern age: that entertainment was never just about passing time or escaping reality. It was about weaving the very fabric of civilization itself. Every board game played in a workers' village strengthened social bonds. Every religious festival reinforced cosmic order. Every story told around a flickering oil lamp transmitted the wisdom of generations. Every dance performed in a temple courtyard connected the earthly realm to the divine. Consider for a moment the extraordinary sophistication of their approach to what we might dismissively call fun. The game of Senet wasn't merely a way to while away an evening. It was a cosmic journey that prepared the soul for the afterlife, while teaching strategy, patience, and acceptance of fate. The great festivals weren't simply excuses for revelry. They were carefully orchestrated events that renewed the social contract between pharaoh and people, reinforced religious beliefs, and provided essential psychological release from the hardships of daily life. The Egyptians created entertainment that served multiple masters simultaneously. A royal hunt wasn't just sport, it was political theatre, religious ritual, and military training rolled into one spectacular performance. A storytelling session wasn't just idle chatter, it was education, moral instruction, and community bonding wrapped in the irresistible package of narrative. A musical performance wasn't just aesthetic pleasure, it was spiritual communion, emotional catharsis, and cultural preservation harmonized into something transcendent. What strikes us most forcefully as we survey this vast landscape of ancient entertainment is how deliberately and thoughtfully it was constructed. Nothing was left to chance. Every game had rules that reflected cosmic principles. Every festival followed calendars that aligned with celestial movements. Every story carried moral lessons that reinforced social values. Every song preserved historical memories or religious truths. The Egyptians didn't stumble into their entertainment culture. They architected it with the same precision they brought to their pyramids and temples. This systematic approach created something remarkable: a civilization where entertainment wasn't separate from the serious business of life, but integral to it. The boundary between sacred and secular, between work and play, between education and amusement was fluid and permeable. A pharaoh's coronation was simultaneously a religious ceremony, a political statement, and a spectacular entertainment. A funeral was at once a solemn ritual, a celebration of life, and an elaborate performance that could last for months. The technological innovations they developed in service of entertainment were staggering. They created some of the world's first board games with complex rules and beautiful craftsmanship. They developed musical instruments of remarkable sophistication and variety. They pioneered theatrical techniques that wouldn't be seen again until classical Greece. They invented cosmetics, perfumes, and decorative arts that turned personal adornment into high art. They created architectural spaces specifically designed for entertainment, from intimate garden pavilions to massive festival courtyards that could accommodate thousands. But perhaps most importantly, they understood that entertainment was a fundamental human need that couldn't be suppressed or ignored. Rather than viewing it as frivolous distraction from more important matters, they recognized it as essential fuel for the human spirit. They saw that people who played together, celebrated together, and shared stories together formed stronger communities. They understood that laughter and joy weren't luxuries to be rationed, but necessities to be cultivated. This wisdom seems almost revolutionary when viewed from our contemporary perspective, where entertainment is often dismissed as trivial or criticized as escapist. The Egyptians would have found such attitudes baffling. For them, entertainment wasn't escape from life. It was engagement with life at its deepest level. It was how they processed the mysteries of existence, transmitted their values, and created meaning from the raw materials of human experience. The legacy of their approach resonates through history in ways both obvious and subtle. The Olympic Games that still captivate billions today echo the competitive festivals that drew crowds to ancient Memphis and Thebes. The board games that families gather around during holidays trace their lineage back to the gaming boards found in Egyptian tombs. The stories we tell our children before bed carry forward the tradition of narrative entertainment that flourished along the Nile thousands of years ago. Even our modern understanding of celebrity and spectacle owes something to the Egyptians, who elevated their pharaohs to divine status and created elaborate public performances around their every appearance. The concept of themed entertainment, where immersive experiences transport participants to other worlds, has its roots in the Egyptian festivals that transformed entire cities into stages for mythological dramas. But the Egyptian approach to entertainment also contained darker currents that we cannot ignore. The same civilization that created beautiful music and poetry also found amusement in gladiatorial combat and public executions. The same people who played gentle board games also enjoyed brutal animal hunts and warfare. The same culture that celebrated life also practiced human sacrifice and elaborate rituals of death. This complexity reminds us that entertainment has always been a double-edged sword, capable of both elevating and degrading the human spirit. The Egyptians themselves seemed aware of this duality. Their art and literature contain numerous warnings about excess and moral corruption. They understood that entertainment could become addiction, that pleasure could become vice, that spectacle could become cruelty. Their religious and philosophical traditions emphasized balance and moderation, seeking to harness the power of entertainment while avoiding its pitfalls. As we stand at the end of our exploration, we're left with profound questions about our own relationship with entertainment. In an age of digital distractions and virtual realities, what can we learn from a civilization that viewed entertainment as sacred duty? In a time when we often consume entertainment passively and individually, what wisdom might we glean from people who created it actively and communally? In an era when entertainment is often separated from meaning and purpose, how might we recapture the Egyptian integration of fun and significance? The ancient Egyptians offer us a vision of entertainment as something more than mere diversion. They show us how play can be profound, how spectacle can be spiritual, how fun can be fundamental to human flourishing. They remind us that the things we do for joy and pleasure aren't separate from the serious business of building civilization. They are essential to it. Their legacy challenges us to think more deeply about the role of entertainment in our own lives and societies. It invites us to consider whether our modern entertainment culture truly serves human needs or merely exploits them. It encourages us to ask whether we're creating forms of fun that strengthen communities and transmit wisdom, or simply consuming products that isolate us and diminish us. The strange things the ancient Egyptians did for fun weren't really so strange after all. They were profound expressions of human creativity, ingenuity, and social intelligence. They were attempts to make sense of existence, to find joy in difficulty, to create bonds that transcended individual mortality. They were, in short, deeply human responses to the eternal challenge of how to live meaningfully in an uncertain world. And in that sense, perhaps we are not so different from those ancient people dancing in temple courtyards, playing games by lamplight, and telling stories under desert stars. We too seek meaning in our entertainment. We too use play to process reality. We too gather together in search of shared joy and common purpose. The forms may have changed, but the fundamental human needs that drive us to seek fun and meaning remain remarkably constant across the millennia. the ancient Egyptians understood something that we would do well to remember. That entertainment isn't the opposite of serious life. It's one of the ways serious life gets lived. It's how we learn, how we bond, how we heal, how we hope. It's how we transform the mere passage of time into something richer, deeper, and more beautiful. In their strange and wonderful approaches to fun, they created a template for human flourishing that still has much to teach us today. Based on the reference materials provided, here's part 12 of the script for Boring History: Strange Things People Did for Fun in Ancient Egypt. As we reach the end of our journey through the dusty corridors of ancient Egyptian entertainment, it's remarkable to see how these seemingly strange practices actually reveal a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and depth. What might appear bizarre to our modern eyes was, in fact, a carefully orchestrated system of activities that served multiple vital functions in Egyptian society. The games they played, from the strategic complexities of Senet to the physical challenges of their athletic competitions, weren't merely diversions. They were training grounds for the mind and body, preparing individuals for the challenges of both earthly life and the perilous journey through the afterlife. When an Egyptian nobleman spent hours contemplating his next move in a game of Senet, he was simultaneously engaging in strategic thinking, religious contemplation, and social bonding. Their festivals and celebrations, with their elaborate pageantry and community participation, created powerful shared experiences that reinforced cultural identity and religious beliefs. The Opet Festival wasn't just a party, it was a massive communal affirmation of divine order and social cohesion. These events brought together people from all walks of life, from the highest priest to the humblest farmer, creating bonds that strengthened the entire civilization. Even their most unsettling practices, the human sacrifices and violent spectacles that seem so alien to us today, served specific cultural functions. They reinforced power structures, provided outlets for aggression, and created dramatic demonstrations of divine authority that helped maintain social order in a complex society. Perhaps most fascinating is how the Egyptians seamlessly blended the sacred and the profane in their entertainment. Their tomb experiences weren't just morbid fascinations with death, but sophisticated attempts to transform mortality into meaning. They turned the ultimate human fear into a source of communal strength and individual purpose. The theatrical performances and storytelling traditions they developed didn't just entertain, they educated. Through dramatic retellings of mythological tales and historical events, they transmitted crucial cultural knowledge across generations. A child watching a performance about the gods wasn't just being entertained, they were receiving a comprehensive education in theology, ethics, and social expectations. Their innovations in role-playing and social reversals during festivals provided crucial psychological outlets in a highly stratified society. These temporary inversions of normal social order allowed for the release of tensions that might otherwise have torn their civilization apart. Even the darkest aspects of their entertainment culture served this function, providing controlled spaces for the expression of violence and aggression. What emerges from our exploration is a picture of a civilization that understood something profound about human nature. They recognized that joy, meaning, and community are not luxuries, but necessities for a thriving society. Their approach to entertainment was holistic, addressing spiritual, psychological, social, and educational needs simultaneously. The ancient Egyptians created a culture where fun was never frivolous. Every game, every festival, every story served multiple purposes, weaving together entertainment with education, pleasure with purpose, individual fulfillment with communal strength. They understood that a civilization's approach to leisure and entertainment reveals its deepest values and priorities. As we close this exploration of ancient Egyptian entertainment, we're left with valuable insights about the role of fun and meaning in human life. Their legacy reminds us that entertainment at its best doesn't just distract us from life's challenges, but helps us build the resilience, community connections, and sense of purpose we need to face those challenges together. In our modern world of endless entertainment options, perhaps we could learn something from the Egyptians about creating forms of fun that truly nourish the human spirit. The strange things ancient Egyptians did for fun weren't so strange after all. They were the building blocks of one of history's most enduring civilizations,